All right, week 14. We are looking at more Gothic here, the kind of mature Gothic phase. And I also decided to add a little section here, it'll be in the second video, about women in Gothic art. Women as patrons, women as theologians, images of women. And we've talked about this in various ways in past units, but I wanted to include this more explicitly here because our readings for Gothic art, which I am very excited about, they don't cover women explicitly, but they cover other important topics that often go neglected. So, thinking, for example, this week about Jewish art in the Middle Ages, or thinking next week about the ivory trade. Where does all of this ivory come from? So these are really crucial topics, but I also wanted to discuss women as well. But we're going to start with these jam figures here. These are the figures that are on the side of a portal. And we're looking at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Rheims in France. And what I think, there's a number of reasons why I think these jam figures are so illuminating. So this is the coronation church of French kings. We're on the west facade, so that huge, massive westward entry. And these jam figures present to us two narrative scenes, the Annunciation and then the Visitation. So let's look here. So the Annunciation is here on the left, where the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she is pregnant with the Son of God. And then we see a visitation scene here on the right of Ram. This is a scene from the life of Mary, where she visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is also pregnant with the person who is to become John the Baptist. Now, what we see in these scenes is a kind of emerging, a kind of evolution of Gothic, really. So let's first take the visitation scene, the older grouping here. These figures are extremely classical. We have contrapposto stances, classical proportions, robes. They are also much more independent from the architecture. They're much more three-dimensional. And let's just go back a generation earlier to these jam figures here from Chartres Cathedral. Look at how columnar their bodies are. They really are still very much dependent on the architectural framework. These figures here, just a few decades later, much more three-dimensional, much more dynamic. But then we move a generation further to the Annunciation figures, and we see the emergence of a new style. This is kind of moving into the later Gothic period, and a style that's called International Gothic, with these long, graceful, elegant, skinny figures. Look at how tiny Gabriel's head is, and then how long his body is. This is International Gothic is a courtly style. It's extremely refined, with these teeny little heads, sweet smiles. This reflects a kind of aristocratic taste and a moving away here from this kind of naturalism and classicism that we see in the mature or the high Gothic. I love this artifact, because it makes us really think about who these architects and designers were. Often in the Middle Ages, it's hard to recreate. We don't have a lot of documents that give us much indication about who these people were. But we know that through the 13th and then into the 14th centuries, architects, that name did not exist. They were known as masons. So no distinction is made between architect and mason. And the education began with an apprenticeship as a stone cutter, and then one would gradually acquire prominence because of a special aptitude. And what we're looking at here is Villard de Honnecourt's Lodge Book. This is the only known personal record of an architect's interests and concerns in the 13th century. we know a little bit about him. He worked for the Cistercians. He also knew of the cathedral at Cambrai. Um, it it also looks like he went on a huge journey east to Hungary, and it's possible that he used Cistercian connections because kind of bounced from Cistercian monastery to monastery. What we're looking at here are two pages from this lodge book, from this sketchbook. And what we see is that he observed, sketched, and recorded solutions to architectural and technological tasks. And um, this might ring a bell from the lectures from last week, because we see the tracery of the westward towers of Laon Cathedral. And we know it's Laon because look who is peeking beyond the tracery here. We have these oxen faces that are unique to Laon. We also see here, this page is fascinating to me, the way that Villard de Honnecourt is taking simple geometric shapes and superimposing them on natural forms, on faces, animals, trying to kind of understand the basis of design that he sees around him. All right, let's look at Salisbury Cathedral. This is so kind of thinking, again, one generation ahead of Canterbury. And Salisbury is interesting for us because it was a single building campaign that lasted from 1220 to 1258. That's actually a pretty short, cohesive amount of time when we think about medieval building. And there was no pre-existing structure here. So really, the builders could create something that was cohesively Gothic. What we see in English design is that it's much more horizontal. Looking at the westwork here, we don't have those huge soaring westward towers. Instead, we have a crossing tower here. Sometimes we see that in continental Europe, but sometimes not. There's also, let me see, no, I don't have another picture, but look here, we have no rose window, instead lancet windows. There's no elaborate entrance portal with jam figures and tympana, and the plan is also very different. These two large transepts stick out much beyond the walls of the nave. And then we also see a square east end here, a square choir, not the kind of cohesive design, for example, of Chartres or Saint-Denis, with the radiating chapels kind of fluidly transitioning into the ambulatory, but much more blocky in this English Gothic variant. If we move to Germany, we also see a different approach to Gothic here as well. That each place we visit, the Gothic is morphed a little bit. It's transformed. And in Germany, the key here is what is called a hall church plan. This is a plan that is one story. So look, instead of the main nave aisle, the gallery, the clerestory, we have the side aisles here in St. Elizabeth and Marburg. They are just as tall as that central aisle. And we don't see that kind of division in the elevation, but instead we have a kind of more unified space when the nave and the side aisles are equal height. This points in the direction of the increasing emphasis on the sermon in this time. I mean, look at that German church. It looks almost more like a lecture hall. And even though we are centuries away from the Protestant Reformation, we do see a little bit of this kind of reform, this little spark of reform in this German design. The floor is very spacious to accommodate large crowds who would come and listen to the sermon. And so we need more of that horizontal expanse, not the verticality. And thus, St. Elizabeth doesn't have flying buttresses. Those aren't necessary. And, really comparing this side by side by the kind of French Gothic, the kind of origins of the Gothic here really make those differences stand out. All right, let me just circle back to sculpture here in Germany, because here we also see similar subjects to French cathedral sculpture, but they are put on the inside rather than the outside. So these figures of Eckehart and Ute, again, I would put those names on the top 10 list for this semester. They are not on a door jamb or an entrance portal, but instead they are inside, attached to the columns there. They also have a different relationship to the columns. So again, comparing them to the earlier jamb figures from Chartres, we're about a few decades apart here, looking at Chartres and Naumburg. They are more independent. They're more bulky. They almost kind of dwarf the architecture instead of the architecture overwhelming and defining them. They are also not delicate like the French figures. We might call them more solid and more Germanic, just kind of emphasizing more cultural differences in general. They have these really heavy robes, and look at that naturalism here, this clear interest here in the structures of the face, naturalistic body proportions, understanding how drapery falls. In fact, looking underneath the drapery here of Ute, we can see her arm as it kind of pulls the collar of her cape up around her jawline, and we can see that clear shape of her body underneath the folds of the drapery. Very sophisticated in its approach to naturalism.